Mankind has always looked to the stars. Since time immemorial, the universe has been a source of fascination and fundamental questions. What else is out there? How was all this created? Where do we come from? Humankind is once again looking to fly to the moon. Our fascination with the nearest heavenly body to Earth has been rekindled. Among the nations planning new unmanned and manned missions are the major space powers, America, Russia and China, but also Europe, Japan and India. The history of the moon is also the history of Earth, and it may become humankind's first home away from home in space. Welcome to Spacetime with Ulrich Walter, astronaut and scientist. He knows, in space, incredible things are in store for us. A new era of lunar research has dawned. It's no longer politically motivated as it was during the Cold War, but serves largely scientific purposes. Probes can measure, explore and map the moon with greater precision than ever before. And traces of ice have been found. The existence of a water resource means rocket fuel could be generated on the moon, allowing for a first ever manned mission deep into the solar system.
What do you mean, you might ask? We've been to the moon. We flew to the moon in the late 60s and early 70s. Why are we going again? In fact, we've been there the whole time, with unmanned missions, for example, Clementine, a probe mapping the lunar surface, and L-Cross. But unmanned missions don't count. So now the Americans are saying, we're pioneers. We want to head back into space, to the moon, and then on to Mars. When will we fly a manned mission to the moon? The Americans say 2023, 2024. But we won't be landing there. Instead, like Apollo 8, we'll be orbiting it, making sure the technology works, then coming straight back. The same situation as in the late 60s.
The first manned spacecraft to reach the moon, Apollo 8, was a symbol of Western superiority. On board were 3 US astronauts, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders. They became the first humans to orbit the moon and see its far side. A celestial mission, but one dogged by somewhat down-to-earth problems.
One of my colleagues got quite sick. I won't go into detail, but it was enough to put on an oxygen mask so I wouldn't notice the smell. And it got quite messy, so we spent a long time cleaning up on the way to the moon.
The astronauts had set out to discover space. In the process, they saw planet Earth as it had never been seen before.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, is that pretty?
And here came the Earth up out of the lunar horizon. And there was no plan whatsoever in all of our mission to photograph the Earth. It was all photography of the moon. I didn't even have a light meter. And so I decided to go against the flight plan. And Frank Borman jokingly said, "Hey, Bill, you can't take a picture of the Earth. It's not in the flight plan."
Hey, don't take that. It's not scheduled.
So I grabbed a camera, a Hasselblad, 70 millimeter, with color film and a long lens, a 250 millimeter lens, and started taking pictures, and I just machine gunned them. And one of those pictures became the iconic Earthrise picture.
The iconic Earthrise photograph has gone down in history. The world followed the Apollo 8 mission with bated breath. On Christmas Eve 1968, A year marked by violence, revolution, and protests against the Vietnam War, astronaut Bill Anders addressed the American nation in a live television broadcast from lunar orbit.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
The view of Earth from space made not only the astronauts but mankind aware of its place in the universe and its fragility. Almost half a century after that mission, we are once again looking beyond our own planet and rekindling our fascination with the moon.
The moon is of great cultural significance to us. The night is forbidding, and the moon is light in the darkness. It belongs to Earth. It's like a familiar neighbor. It protects us. It stands between us and outer space.
The moon is the nearest celestial body, a mere 3-day spaceflight away.
When I see the moon in the sky, I always imagine there to be humans, or that there could be humans there, and what sort of a habitat it could be. One day there might be someone there in a spacesuit, in this habitat, and looking up at Earth. It's an incredible thought.
The moon appeals to our imaginations, stirs within us a desire to leave our own planet and conquer space. As early as 1865, French writer Jules Verne described an attempted moon landing in his novel From the Earth to the Moon, and in 1902, French filmmaker Georges Méliès made A Trip to the Moon, in which a group of astronomers traveled to the moon and glimpsed the most spectacular view of the modern age, captured decades later by Bill Anders, the Earth rising over the lunar horizon. It was the moon that first prompted humankind to wonder if we are alone in the universe. A question that has long intrigued astronomers and artists, but in fact, we still know relatively little about the moon.
The moon has never been extensively researched. It's extraordinary, really, given how near it is. But it's been somewhat eclipsed by research of the planets in our solar system. The moon is actually very exciting. It most probably formed when the Earth collided with another astronomical body. Unlike Earth, it has no flora and fauna. It's a bit of an archive of early history, and that makes it very interesting.
The moon is the result of a cosmic catastrophe. The giant impact hypothesis is the most widely accepted theory on the moon's origins. Approximately 4.5 billion years ago, a protoplanet, roughly the size of Mars, slammed into the red-hot Earth. The energy released by this giant impact melted vast amounts of Earth's solid rock, which ricocheted into space. The force of gravity pulled these fragments into a cloud of dust and gas, which within several thousand years condensed into the moon. This theory explains the moon's size. It also fits with the moon's age and its trajectory around the Earth. According to another theory, the Earth's gravity captured the moon into its orbit, but scientists are skeptical.
Could the Earth have captured the moon in its orbit? In terms of celestial mechanics, does this make sense? If you apply the laws of physics, is it possible? We know that larger celestial objects can capture smaller ones, but can the Earth? The capture theory is fairly unlikely, and that doesn't leave many alternatives. It's more likely that the moon was formed by a planetary collision.
From Earth, we only see one side of the moon, but even the far side of the moon, often referred to as the dark side, experiences 2 weeks of sunlight followed by 2 weeks of night.
Have you ever wondered why we only see one side of the moon? It's complicated. But look, this is Earth, and this is the moon traveling around the Earth. So not only is it rotating around the Earth, it must also be rotating on its own axis, so that the same side is always visible to Earth. Is this a coincidence? No, it's not a coincidence. It's what we call astrodynamics. The gravitational force of the Earth is not parallel, but rather disperses at the edges. And that means the moon is stretched. If this is Earth, it's elongated in this direction. And that means that it can no longer rotate on its axis as freely. And what that means is that over billions of years it lost rotational energy, and what's called lock-in happened. The moon's own rotation is synchronized with its rotation around the Earth. Reaching that point took billions of years, and that's the reason why we always see the same side of the moon. But people have always wondered what the far side of the moon looks like. Does it look like this, with light and dark shading? Thousands of years passed before finally, relatively recently, we had our answer.
The far side of the moon was photographed for the first time by the Soviet probe Luna 3. Nowadays, orbiters can deliver high-resolution images that show the far side of the moon is a very different place from the side visible to Earth. There is far less of the dark shading we see on the near side. In the past, astronomers mistook these patches for seas and called them Maria, Latin for seas. The Maria are roughly 3 billion years old and were most probably formed by the collision of giant meteoroids with a lunar surface. These collisions punched holes in the moon's crust, which later filled with vast lakes of lava that formed the dark areas. But this theory has never been confirmed. Another theory posits that these dark plains are not ancient impact basins, but rather the result of volcanic and seismic activity. Recent measurements of lunar gravity appear to show that the largest dark spot on the moon, known as the Ocean of Storms, is the result of a geological process. In either case, the fact that the moon is tidally locked to Earth could explain why there are more Maria on the near side of the moon. The Earth's gravitational force might once have acted on lunar lava, just as the moon's gravitational force acts on Earth's oceans. What we do know for sure is that the moon was bombarded with large and small rocks. These explain the differently sized craters that define its appearance. From Earth, we can make out over 300,000 craters with a diameter of more than a kilometer.
The moon was formed when an astronomical body collided with Earth. This threw a huge amount of debris into orbit, which is why we have a relatively large moon. Look at this. The diameter of the moon is roughly a quarter of the Earth's. This 1:4 ratio is unique in the solar system and has very important consequences. First of all, the rise and fall of ocean tides. The moon's gravity acts on the Earth's oceans, causing a bulge where ocean waters face the moon, and low tide on the sides. The second important reason why the moon is good for Earth has to do with the fact that our planet is not really round. It's actually flattened because it's spinning, as we can see here. It's swollen by about 40 kilometers more at the equator than at its poles. Picture it as a sphere with a bulge around the equator. The moon's gravitational force acts on the bulge and keeps Earth in this rotational axis. This means that over billions of years, the Earth's rotational axis has remained more or less unchanged. That ensured our survival because it guaranteed that the climate remained constant for millennia. This was not the case on Mars, only on Earth. Without the moon, there would be no mankind. How do we know all this? Well, 50 years ago we went to the moon, and that taught us a lot about the moon and Earth.
July 16th, 1969, a Saturn V rocket launched the Apollo 11 mission. On board were astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin, Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins. The goal was to land on the moon and actually step onto the lunar surface. It was the most spectacular mission in the history of mankind.
I stayed up all night following it on television. My father had laid the groundwork much earlier, in 1957, when the Sputnik was launched. He said, "Listen, son, up there is the Sputnik." After that, I always followed every spaceflight, and of course, that particular one that night. I couldn't go to bed. I was so excited. I stayed up all night.
Apollo 11 traveled for 4 days before landing on the moon on July 20th, 1969 at 2017 UTC. The landing site was the Mare Tranquillitatis, Tranquility Base. The first man on the moon was Neil Armstrong, followed 15 minutes later by Buzz Aldrin. They planted a US flag, installed a laser reflector, and collected samples. The astronauts took away with them 21.6 kilos of moon rock. But the mission's purpose wasn't really to further science.
The Apollo program was not a program of science or exploration. The Apollo program was one to beat the Soviet communists, to show not only the United States, but also the rest of the world that our system, democracy, capitalism, was better.
5 other Apollo missions also landed astronauts on the moon. The last man to leave his footprint in moon dust was Eugene Cernan in December 1972. After that, it seemed that interest in the moon began to wane.
There has been a renewed interest in the moon in recent years as a launching pad for further space flights, such as to Mars. Going to the moon is like taking a first step out of your front door. The point of the Apollo missions, which were of course American, was a demonstration of technological expertise. But if you want to go to Mars, you need to do a bit more. You can't just fly to the moon and say, "Look, we did it." You have to be able to create a bridge effectively between Earth and the moon. For example, by setting up a base there where people could live for several weeks or even months.
Science demands that mankind once again go to the moon. A lunar base would be ideal for testing new technologies. Moreover, the moon is rich in resources. In 2009, a lunar probe found water ice on the moon. 2 years earlier, the X Prize Foundation challenged private investors to land a rover on the lunar surface. The prize money was funded by Google, but none of the contestants were able to meet the target.
The X Prize was canceled at some point. That was regrettable. But Google still succeeded in galvanizing smaller companies, including part-time scientists from Germany, to work towards landing a mission on the moon. Today's world is very different. We no longer have two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, dominating spaceflight the way they did during the Cold War. Now over 70 nations have space programs, plus industry and plus science. What we have is a new world, a wonderful new world that opens up all sorts of new opportunities.
The challenge was not only to land a rover on the moon, but also to transmit back high-definition images and video. The organizers wanted to drive development in new technologies and business in the private space industry.
What was Google hoping to achieve with the X Prize? Well, in 2007, Google said the first team to land a robotic spacecraft on the moon and travel 500 meters would be awarded $20 million. But is 20 million enough? No, it's not. More than 20 teams applied, but they ended up having to invest a lot more. A rocket alone, one that can fly from the Earth to the moon, requires an investment of 100 million. So the prize money wasn't enough, and that's the reason why the competition was canceled. But that doesn't mean the money invested was wasted. Not at all. They were young engineers, highly motivated experts who helped advance technology. Not only was their participation a valuable experience, these young people will go on to develop more affordable technologies that will boost spaceflight to the moon and maybe later even to Mars.
German teams also joined the competition. The most promising candidates came from Berlin, a new generation with dreams of going to the moon.
Ich fand das vom Gedanken her so unglaublich.
The idea is just so extraordinary. The idea of developing something to send to the moon with private investment. That was the original incentive for me to start discussing with friends, associates, and just about anyone I could find. Is it worth it? Is it doable? Don't you have to be NASA? Is it even viable to try this as a private endeavor?
His startup went on to win one of the competition's coveted milestone prizes, worth $750,000. The money was funneled into the company. Working under market conditions, the young private space company is forging ahead with its mission to the moon. The team is developing a lunar rover and a spacecraft to transport it.
Our aim is to bring down the cost of space exploration. For example, a university that has developed an instrument can come to us and say, we'd like to experiment on the surface of the moon. So for a fee, we could get them there and allow them to conduct their experiment. For now, the space industry is government-funded and therefore very bureaucratic and political. We want to provide a service that gives countries and universities that couldn't do this before the opportunity to go to the surface of the moon.
Thanks to the Apollo missions and technological progress, unmanned missions to the moon are now realistic options for privately funded companies, but not prohibitively so. A new era in space travel is dawning.
How hard is it to fly to the moon? Well, it's about 400,000 kilometers away. That's quite a bit further than the International Space Station, which orbits just 400 kilometers above Earth's surface. You can get there in no time at all, whereas it takes 2 to 3 days to get to the moon. And then you need to land. You need a lunar landing craft. Then you have to get back. It takes several days to get supplies there. It's a massive undertaking. You need a rocket twice the size of a Soyuz. And once you're on the moon, we have a whole different set of problems from the challenges here on Earth or on the ISS. The temperature's completely different. In daytime, it's about 100 degrees Celsius. and at night about -100, a fluctuation of 200 degrees. You need a spacesuit that can withstand that. And then there's all the solar radiation. I don't mean light, but the solar wind. The protons that rain down on your spacesuit could penetrate it and damage your DNA. Astronauts who have been to the moon generally have a reduced life expectancy. Then there's the pressure inside the spacesuit. Outside, there's a vacuum. The spacesuit is very heavy and hard to move in. These are the sort of problems you face on the moon.
The European Space Agency would like to construct an entire village on the moon. It's still just an idea conceived as a cooperation between different parties and nations. This international scientific research outpost will be called Moon Village.
Space travel has a scientific aspect. It's also about exploration. And there's also a geopolitical aspect. I was keen to take into account how we could boost this geopolitical aspect. And that's how we came up with the idea for a moon village. A village is a community. It's a place where people come together because they think it's interesting and build something up. If you transfer that idea to space, then that place is the moon.
The construction of an international base on the moon would be a logical next step in space research.
The concept of a moon village is very inspiring. I think it's a good way of bringing together various international institutions that can work together to get people on the moon. Getting people on the moon isn't something that any individual nation could or should do by itself. It has to be a major international effort.
A research village on the moon would be a huge boost for the space travel industry. A permanent base would lend itself to the testing of new technologies and would also spur new developments. Technologies could be developed on the moon that would allow for further exploration of the solar system. Scientists could research ways for humans to live away from Earth for extended periods, and an international research station on the moon would also intensify cooperation between nations.
Anyone can fly to the moon. Obviously, it's a technical challenge, but it can be done. There's no security system like at the International Space Station. Anyone can fly to the moon. That's one aspect. The other is that a number of parties are active in the space industry worldwide. If they join forces to reach their destination, this international community can bring about a whole new level of international cooperation.
Scientists and engineers are hard at work researching colonization of distant planets. Above all, they need to find ways of ensuring human survival, be it on the moon or on Mars. Humans will need homes, a habitat. Transporting construction materials from Earth is far too complicated and expensive. Special 3D printers could be the solution.
The idea is that all we'd need on the moon is sand and sun. There's no atmosphere there. So, for example, the sun could be harnessed on Mars and its rays bundled and the sand sintered, meaning melted and molded. Long term, this is a very viable method for deploying the materials at our disposal there. We can create structures that are statically and constructively robust, with a pressure-tight inner shell. That base would allow us to spend several years on the moon conducting research.
The outpost will be built by robots with raw materials and energy extracted on site. It may look like a sci-fi vision cooked up by a screenwriter, but in fact it's a scenario that researchers are already working on.
The plan to use the regolith, the lunar soil, to provide protection against radiation is a realistic one. Even in a worst-case scenario, if processing regolith somehow doesn't work, it can still be used. You can build a habitat and then pile up several meters of regolith. That's the dirty option. A cleaner option would be to compress it into bricks.
Long-term sustainable life on distant planetary bodies, a major challenge for scientists.
There are many practical constraints. The harsh environment, the reduced space available in the spacecraft. The advantage of a self-deployable habitat for extreme environments is that it has components. Its volume could be doubled with inflatable modules.
In future, humans exploring space won't be spending just a few hours on distant planetary bodies, but weeks, months, maybe even years.
Once I've landed on the moon, I have to find a way of positioning the individual modules so that they are actually linked. It's not as if I can just unload the modules and send people there to assemble them. For a start, it's too big a job. And secondly, the habitat needs to be in place before people even arrive. It all has to be in working order. We need to know it works before we put people in a rocket and send them off into space. So it all needs to be conceived so that robots can build the habitat.
Meanwhile, NASA is also planning to return to the moon. The Americans are hoping to send astronauts into space in a new heavy-lift launch vehicle. NASA is also developing what it calls the Lunar Orbital Platform Gateway, a lunar orbit space station.
What's the point of a space station orbiting the moon? The first question is, what sort of orbit will it be? It will bring the station within relatively close range of the lunar surface at closest approach, and then far away again. That orbit will take almost a week. So what purpose does it serve? Well, picture the Orion spacecraft carrying astronauts. It wants to land on the moon. It will dock at the space station. They'll check out, as it were, in order to head onto the moon. And on the return journey, they'll dock at the space station again before traveling back to Earth. That's one aspect. It's also a space station where science can be furthered. Everything we've done orbiting Earth, we now need to do orbiting the moon. For that, we need a platform. From there, we can remotely control rovers and robots on the moon. And what's really important is we want to go to Mars, so the space station could also serve as a stopover.
So far, the International Space Station has been our scientific outpost in space. However, it's scheduled to be deorbited fairly soon. A lunar orbit space station is the next logical step for NASA. But for now, it's still only a plan, and many plans proposed by NASA never make the leap from theory to practice.
NASA has so many plans, and NASA is actually being run by the members of Congress, our Bundestag, Reichstag, around each center, and all they care about is keeping their people employed. They don't care what they do. Build a station on the moon, on Mars, on the sun. As long as NASA is spending the money to keep their people employed, that's what is guiding our space program today. That's sad.
Since the end of the Space Shuttle program, NASA has no longer been able to send astronauts into space by itself. The Americans now cooperate with the Russian space agency Roscosmos, which can launch astronauts to the ISS with its Soyuz rockets. But the Americans don't like being dependent on the Russians. And Roscosmos charges NASA some 60 million euros per passenger. The moon attracts not only scientists and researchers, but also gold diggers. It promises vast deposits of raw materials. The prospect of gold, platinum and iridium mining on the moon and nearby asteroids has captured the imagination of investors and entrepreneurs. Unexpectedly, tiny Luxembourg is aiming to become a global leader in the race to mine resources in outer space.
What are the opportunities? What is possible within the parameters of international law? We've collaborated with several universities and experts. In simple terms, we concluded that the law of the sea could also apply in outer space. No one country can claim it, but it can fish in it and commercially exploit it.
Water extracted on the moon or on asteroids could be separated into hydrogen and oxygen and used to make rocket fuel. Manned missions deep into the far reaches of the solar system would of course need vast amounts of rocket fuel. So a refueling station in space is a lucrative prospect. A number of companies are now busy raising funds to mine for precious metals on the moon or making rocket propellant out of water on the moon.
Mining raw materials on the moon is a realistic scenario. Of course, the question is what you want to do with those materials. One option is to bring them back to Earth, to compensate for dwindling resources here. But that's bound to be very expensive. The other possibility is using the moon's resources to penetrate further into space, mining for water on the moon and using that water to embark on a longer journey to Mars.
Mining natural resources in space with high dividends on Earth. What sounds futuristic may become reality in just a few years.
Space mining,
as it's called, extracting resources in space, is still science fiction. But like so many things that science fiction envisaged, it will very likely happen. I can't say if the moon is the best place for it to start, or nearby asteroids. But the fact is, there are a number of serious companies with a serious space mining agenda.
Government space agencies have a similar agenda. If humankind plans to explore the galaxy, it needs to exploit the resources that space has to offer.
Humankind has never coped well with limits. So why should we assume that humans will one day say, okay, we're done exploring Earth. We know it inside out, and we're staying put, and it's all good. No, I think there will undoubtedly be an urge to explore and discover, not just for economic reasons. Humans will want to explore space, and that's what they'll do.
Will commercial exploitation of celestial bodies prove profitable? Heaven knows.
I don't think I would invest in a company that's doing this. In 200 years, perhaps. Right now, it's too soon. It's not worth it. The costs are too high. I wouldn't invest in moon exploration. It doesn't make economic sense right now.
But if humans want to colonize space, be it the moon or Mars, then in the long run, we need to tap into the resources it harbors.
The moon's resources are perfect because they're ones that we couldn't live without, such as water. There's water in the moon's deepest, darkest craters. There's also regolith, lunar soil that looks like what I have here. This is actually from my garden, but lunar soil looks exactly the same. But it's made of quartz, silicon dioxide. Oxygen can be extracted from it using solar energy, so humans can breathe. Another way of exploiting the moon is to sell it. An American entrepreneur, Dennis Hope, is even selling extraterrestrial real estate. He's made $40 million. Not bad.
Meanwhile, US company Space Adventures has teamed up with Russian space agency Roscosmos to fly paying customers around the moon. The spacecraft is a converted Russian Soyuz capsule. A ticket costs around $150 million. Crazy as it sounds, a number of customers have already dug deep into their pockets for the opportunity to fly to the ISS.
Clearly, there's a renewed interest in the moon. It's very sensible that a global effort is made to realize this amazing project on behalf of humankind.
US entrepreneur Elon Musk also wants in on the action. His private company SpaceX is also planning to offer passenger flights to the moon. These tourists will be flown once around the moon before returning to Earth. Actually, landing on the lunar surface isn't part of the package. The trip will be made in the SpaceX-designed Dragon, a free-flying spacecraft designed to deliver both cargo and people to orbiting destinations. It was originally developed to transport NASA astronauts to the ISS. The first passenger flight is already fully booked, and wealthy customers are lining up for the privilege of enjoying an exclusive view. China is also pursuing an ambitious space program. Its long-term goal is a manned lunar landing.
They say they're going to do it, and my guess is they have the resources. And they right now certainly aren't a first-rate space power. And so I think they'd like to demonstrate to the rest of the world that they have the capability to do it. And my guess is they will.
The Chinese have already successfully launched an unmanned probe into lunar orbit. In December 2013, China's spacecraft Chang'e 3 landed on the moon with the lunar rover Yutu, Chinese for Jade Rabbit. China became the third nation after the US and the former Soviet Union to have achieved a soft landing on the moon. Now it seems a new space race is on.
Let's summarize. We need a space station to dock at before landing on the moon. We will have habitats on the moon. We will endeavor to mine for resources, extract oxygen from regolith, and use lunar water. We will show that it's possible for humans to live on the moon, and not just for months, but for years. But why, you might ask? Well, it's what's called the proving ground. We need to prove that we can survive on the moon. And we need to prove that in order to show that we could survive for several years on Mars. That's what this is all about.
A manned mission to Mars could take place in the foreseeable future. The red planet has been mapped and surveyed. Scientists know the density of the Martian atmosphere and its chemical composition, the temperatures there, and the frequency of sandstorms. Water has been found there, and also traces of methane. Factors that are crucial to figuring out the viability of long-term colonization efforts. The Space Launch System is NASA's Space Shuttle-derived Super Heavy Lift Expendable Launch Vehicle. But it still doesn't have the capacity to transport both equipment and passengers to the Moon. A mission would therefore have to be carried out in phases. First, equipment and material would be flown there, and then the astronauts. But it's only a question of time until the first human sets foot on Mars.
One question is, where will we get the fuel we need? If we fly to Mars, we want to be able to return. Taking what we need with us obviously is not a solution. For example, making fuel from water. That's something we can test on the Moon, because there's water at its poles. Next question, how do we extract it? How do we turn it into hydrogen and oxygen?
The long-term ambition of Elon Musk's company SpaceX is to colonize Mars. Plans to develop spacecraft able to fly several hundred passengers there.
I think as we show that this is possible, that this dream is real, not just a dream, it's something that can be made real, I think the support will snowball over time. And I should say also the main reason I'm personally accumulating assets is in order to fund this. So I really don't have any other motivation for personally accumulating assets except to be able to make the biggest contribution I can to making life multiplanetary.
There is no doubt that one day humans will colonize Mars. Within 2 or 3 generations, 1 million people could be living there. For now, it's still a vision of the future, but private space companies are driving the market and, in the process, spurring technological development. Manned missions to the Moon and Mars grow more likely every day.
What will happen in the next decades? Will we land manned missions on the Moon? Of course we will. If we fly to the Moon, we'll also set foot on it. Will there be a moon village? Well, if we're landing on the Moon, we'll also need habitats. Whether there'll be an entire village, who knows? It depends on how many nations are involved. The more there are, the bigger the village. Will we be using the Moon's raw materials? Of course we will. If we're going to live there, we're going to need water. We'll extract oxygen from the regolith so we can breathe and make rocket fuel, so we can come back to Earth. And what about the space station in lunar orbit? I can't guarantee that will happen. If there's sufficient funding, it makes sense. And I do think there'll be one day. But we can't be sure. But there's one thing we do know for sure. Kraft Arnold Ericke, an engineer who worked in the 1950s, once said, if God wanted man to become a spacefaring species, he would have given man a moon. The Moon is indeed our springboard into space. And remember, the Moon stabilizes the Earth's axis and our climate. We wouldn't exist without the Moon.
A new space race to the Moon is underway. Private and government space agencies are planning manned missions to the lunar surface. The aim? To use the Moon as a stepping stone into the solar system.